Death is the only escape!
Coming up next is Gothic the Harvester. Gothic is kind of a weird boss, as his difficulty is decided pretty much right away based on how your raid handles their positioning. Kinda like Thorum. A gate cuts the boss arena in half, the entry side often dubbed Life Side, spawning standard fare Death Knight style adds throughout the encounter. But once those enemies die, their souls travel to the other side, often called Dead Side, and form into a new type of enemy. This meant that splitting your raid up to handle both sides was important. If you kept all your raid on the life side, the dead side would eventually overwhelm and wipe your raid. Splitting your raid core up properly to handle both sides seems easy enough, except for the fact that the dead side adds were often far more challenging than the life side counterparts, meaning that the majority of your raid would be on dead side, but you had to create a proper balance of handling, or you could wipe on life side as well. Lucky enough the boss himself wasn't that hard, or else this fight would have sucked. Up next is Saffron. This fight was dreadful for me as a newly learning Holy Paladin in Wrath. I had played a mage from vanilla on and never really healed before. Saffron's big gimmick is his constant AoE frost damage he's doing to the raid. Mix that up with random blizzards, a frontal cleave and back tail swipe, and the stressful ice block phase that people seem to suck at quite a bit, and you have a healer's worst nightmare. The constant damage made healing very stressful, especially for me, even with frost resistance aura, and as I said earlier, people really sucked at hiding behind ice blocks, so getting one-shotted was quite common. Oh, and then there was also a decursed drain life too, but that was never really a problem, so it's whatever.
The first kill goes to me. Anyone care to wager?
At number 7 is the 4 Horsemen. Surprisingly, the OG king of difficulty of vanilla WoW isn't number 1 on my list, and that is because once again Blizzard's nerf hammer just went a little too far on these poor bastards. Now that doesn't mean they don't have their fair share of difficulty, however. A poorly positioned core, bad stat counters, or sad healing could easily cause a wipe, as the raid was greatly split up during this encounter. We've always used the strat of one healer up mid with both tanks and me and a hunter in the back with the other 2 adds. It reduced the number of issues we could have with the encounter, and that's why I'm not giving it as much leeway as the other raid bosses that come ahead. But if you struggled with this encounter, I wouldn't be surprised either. Positioning was everything and there was a lot going on.
Eat your bones! Break you!
Number 6 is here, and it is Therian. Another king daddy of vanilla Nax. People can't suck enough at this boss. Over-threading on the ads before the boss? Check. Falling in slime? Check. Crossing polar opposites? Jesus Christ, check. I hate this boss. So the big gimmick here is to stack the given positive and negative debuffs together with their own groups. This provides a large damage buff to allow the raid to beat his enrage timer. Problem is, much like a real battery, if you cross the polar opposites, you're in for an electrifying experience. And this Frankenstein has no issue with giving you said experience. What was perfected in vanilla Nax has sadly been diminished as time passed. It was very common to see people run through opposite groups to get to their groups, or to even run through the boss's legs, zapping a crapload of people in the process. Lucky he himself didn't hit too hard, or this boss would have been nearly impossible for the newer generation of raiders.
The races of the world will perish. It is only a matter of time.
Coming up next is Heigen the Unclean. You can dance if you want to. You can say, screw this boss. No, serious. Heigen wins the award of the most gimped boss for his time period. Heigen's big go-to mechanic is that his room is exploding from the very seams with lava. The explosions happen in sequences, meaning remembering the sequence order, which is always the same, and knowing positioning is key here. Sadly, Blizzard hadn't added the raid icon markers, meaning that most cores either use smoke bombs or taught our raiders to stay with specifically marked players to avoid lava hits. Unfortunately, bad computers and internet connections made this encounter a nightmare for most guilds that had these kind of problems, and mine was definitely one of them. I was actually quite good at this encounter and its positioning. Sadly, I was a healer, meaning I could only really help out with the second phase, as during the first phase I had to be on the platform to avoid the spellcasting debuff. Ugh, a simple boss with a very punishing mechanic. At number 4 is Gluth. I hate this boss, I hate this boss, I hate this boss! Gluth is pretty basic in nature when it comes to bosses. He has a healing debuff that he puts on tanks that has to be rotated once too high to prevent the tank from being unhealable. He also enrages periodically through the fight, so extra heals may be needed. But sadly, those aren't the biggest issues here. Kiting zombies is, however. Zombies spawn throughout the fight and must be kited away from the boss or he will eat them and heal. This means a kiter must be assigned, which usually is a hunter or a mage, and kite the zombies around the room for a set amount of time. However, zombies do keep spawning throughout the encounter, meaning the kiter will have their hands quite full for the majority of the fight, dealing with the adds. It doesn't help that the adds stack a painful debuff on you if they hit you, meaning you better kite well. Eventually, Gluth decimates the room, leaving everyone at the bottom of the barrel on HP, and forcing the zombies to head straight for the boss. The zombies then have to be AoE'd down, or it may be game over. This encounter tests the skills of your tank on proper swapping, your heals on raid coverage and kite support, and of course your DPS on the ability to step outside of their comfort zones and do more than just rotate on a boss.
Soldiers of the Cold Dark, obey the call of KelThuzad.
We are at our top 3, and at number 3 is the final boss of Naxxramas, KelThuzad. It was a massive toss-up between number 3 and number 2, as both are challenging bosses in their own way, but I recall having slightly less stress out of this encounter, so here we are. KelThuzad has 2 main phases, a typical Lich-style add phase and a tank phase. The add phase I won't talk about too much as it was pretty easy and not many people had trouble with it, but his second phase is another demon entirely. Phase 2, KT has some pretty strong abilities to contend with. First up is the frostbolt damage he's doing to the tank and raid, some of which needs to be interrupted to prevent massive tank damage. He also lays out void zones that'll one-shot anyone silly enough to stand in them, meaning simple attention mistakes were commonplace. He also summons adds at lower percentage that must be off-tanked while the boss is being burned down, meaning yay, more healing needed. Naturally, he also possessed the ability to mind control several players, meaning CC was in great need as well. Of course, his most dangerous ability was his chaining ice block ability that forced random players into ice blocks, dealing massive percentile damage to them over time. This had to be healed quickly, meaning awareness for healers was key, but to make it worse, it could chain to anyone within 10 yards of the targeted ice block, meaning you could end up with too many ice blocks for healers to keep up with. Overall, this boss was a massive endurance test and easily one of WoW's best encounters, if you're willing to go through the stress to down him.
The powers contained here are sufficient to destroy the world 10 times over!
At number 2 is Malygos. As I mentioned before, this spot and my number 3 spot flipped around quite a bit before I decided on their positioning. The thing is, Malygos on paper is pretty simple. He isn't complicated like KelThuzad, nor is he as punishing. Sadly, it didn't stop a lot of cores from struggling with this boss. Malygos starts with a basic tank phase in which sparks must be stopped from reaching the boss and destroyed. Lucky you, they give a nice damage buff if you stand in them after they die. Unlucky you, if your core sucks at stopping them, Malygos gets the damage buff and you're in a lot of trouble. His second phase is an add phase that was pretty good to test your healers and your raid's ability to move on command. It's his final phase that was sadly where a lot of people got wrecked. Once transitioned, Malygos destroys the platform you're on, and red dragons are used for the rest of the encounter to fight the boss. Utilizing your dragon's ability to do rampant damage and heal the raid was a new mechanic to learn that could be very time consuming to learn as well, especially considering it's the last phase of the boss. But sadly, a lot of people sucked at it even towards Ulduar time period. People would drop their damage stacks or suck at dodging lightning, and it just led to a lot of wiping that could have been avoided if raiders just paid a little more attention. At least I got a sexy pair of shoulders out of it, but I don't even think they were worth it.
This pathetic siege ends now!
We are at our number 1 spot, and there could only be one encounter to take this spot. It had to be 3 Drakes Up Therian. Much like in my Ulduar video, I opted to skip out on the middle of hard modes in favor of the final product, and I think Sar 3D gets his point across very easy that way. He's not easy, no matter how many drakes he has. Therian, as I mentioned earlier, is a nice average difficulty boss for cores with new raiders, or people with low attention spans. But what happens if 3 Twilight Drakes assist Sarth as well? The pure damage potential your raid will endure during this encounter is maddening, not to mention your core now has to manage both Sarth's abilities and the incoming Twilight Drakes, meaning a mixture of one-shot void zones and nasty lava waves spelled your raid core's doom. Oh god. Of course, guilds would, as Wrath of the Lich King went on, master ways to DPS this boss down before the second Drake could even arrive to assist Sarth, but even then this encounter was still not easy. Sar 3D held its difficulty with randoms and cores through a large chunk of Wrath of the Lich King, well outside of tier 7, and to this date is one of WoW's most challenging encounters. At least you got a sexy mount out of it, right? Right? Well, that is it. I have ranked all of the tier 7 raid bosses. I hope you enjoyed the list. Of course, I want to see what your guild or core struggled with as well, so drop your personal experiences in the comments. If you enjoyed my video, why not subscribe and check out some of my other Blizzard content as well. I'm Captain Potato, and I'll see you guys next time, next video.